Hello my dear listeners, and welcome back to our cozy haven of stories and gentle whispers. I'm delighted you've chosen to spend this time with me as we venture into one of the most hauntingly beautiful legends to ever emerge from the mists of ancient Ireland. Tonight, we're traveling to a place where time moves differently, where youth never fades, and where love blooms eternal beneath skies untouched by sorrow. This is the story of Oisín and his gentle memories of Tír na nÓg, the land of the young, and it is a tale that has warmed Irish hearts and captivated the imaginations of storytellers for over 1,000 years. Picture yourself, if you will, settling into the softest corner of your world. Let the worries of the day drift away like morning mist over water. Imagine a time so ancient that it exists now only in memory and story, when Ireland was young and wild, filled with magic that hummed through forests and danced across silver lakes. In this age of wonder, there lived a people whose deeds would echo through centuries, whose names would become legend, whose very existence would blur the line between myth and history. This is the age of the Fianna, and within their tales lives one of the most tender and tragic stories ever told, one that speaks to the eternal human longing for home, for love, and for the bitter sweetness of memory itself. The legend of Oisín is not merely a story of adventure or conquest, though it contains both in abundance. It is, at its heart, a meditation on time itself, on the nature of beauty and its inevitable loss, on the conflict between duty and desire, and on the profound ache that comes from loving something that must eventually slip through one's fingers like grains of golden sand. It is a story whispered by mothers to their children on long winter nights, recited by poets who understood that some truths can only be conveyed through the delicate machinery of myth. And it is a story that has survived the centuries precisely because it speaks to something eternally human within us all, a recognition that exists beyond language and culture, beyond any particular time or place. As we settle into this narrative together, I invite you to let your mind wander across ancient landscapes. Allow yourself to feel the sea spray on your face as we journey across impossible waters. Experience the timelessness of a realm where nothing ages and everything is eternally beautiful. And perhaps, most importantly, open your heart to understanding the gentle sorrow of a warrior who discovered that paradise and home cannot, in the end, be the same place. This is a story of love discovered, joy experienced, and the profound cost of choice. So let us begin, together, at the place where it all started, in the verdant and ancient lands of pre-Christian Ireland, where legend lived as naturally as breath. The world of the Fianna, warriors of destiny and protectors of the land. To truly understand the story of Oisín, we must first understand the world from which he came, the society that shaped him, and the incredible band of warriors known as the Fianna. For without this context, his journey to Tír na nÓg becomes merely a romantic adventure rather than the profound tragedy that it truly is. The Fianna represents something remarkable in the history of human organizations and values, a blend of martial prowess, artistic sensitivity, intellectual achievement, and moral integrity that created a unique form of warrior culture. The Fianna were not ordinary soldiers in any conventional sense. They were something far more remarkable and far more complex, embodying ideals that transcended mere military function. Imagine, if you will, a brotherhood of warriors unlike any that existed in ordinary military hierarchies. These were men chosen not merely for their physical strength, though they possessed that in abundance, but for their courage, their cunning, their wisdom, and their profound sense of honor. The Fianna lived apart from regular society, dwelling in the forests and wild places of Ireland, sustaining themselves through hunting and moving constantly across the landscapes of the land, following deer through hidden valleys and pursuing enemies to Ireland's far shores. According to the old records and traditions, they were sometimes called landless warriors, existing outside the ordinary structures of society, beholden to kings yet independent in their daily operations and governance. What made the Fianna truly extraordinary was their code of conduct, a a set of principles that bound them not through coercion or legal obligation, but through bonds of brotherhood stronger than blood itself. They lived by a sacred oath, one that defined not merely what they did but who they were at the deepest levels of their being. Their motto, whispered and remembered across generations and preserved in the old stories, was simple yet profound in its implications: purity of our hearts, strength of our limbs, action to match our speech. These were not mere words spoken in passing at ceremonies or written on banners. They were the very essence of what it meant to be Fianna, a code by which they lived and, when necessary, by which they died. Every action a member of the Fianna undertook was meant to reflect these principles, and those who failed to live by them were held to account by their brothers in arms. The leader of the Fianna during much of their history was a man named Fionn McCool, a figure whose reputation had grown to such legendary proportions that he seemed to exist as much in the realm of the divine as in the mortal world. The name Fionn itself means fair or white or bright, reflecting his distinctive appearance, though he was also born with the name Niamh, meaning fawn or young deer. Fionn's story itself is worthy of deep contemplation and respect. Born under tragic circumstances, with his father McCool having been killed in battle and with enemies actively seeking his death to eliminate any claim to leadership, Fionn was raised in secret in the forests, hidden away from those who would have destroyed him. He was trained in the ways of warfare and wisdom by those who understood both the physical arts of combat and the spiritual and intellectual dimensions of knowledge. It was said that Fionn possessed a magic thumb, a gift granted to him through a remarkable encounter with the legendary Salmon of Knowledge, the wisest creature in all of Ireland. According to the legends, by sucking this magical thumb at moments of great difficulty, he could access all the wisdom of the world in vivid, immediate flashes of knowing that transcended ordinary understanding. Fionn McCool was, by all accounts, a leader like no other in the history of Ireland. He was known for his generosity and his justice, for his cunning in battle and his compassion in victory. Warriors from across Ireland sought to join his band, knowing that to be Fianna under Fionn was to be part of something greater than oneself, something that would be remembered and honoured for generations to come. The entrance requirements for membership in the Fianna were stringent and demanding, designed to ensure that only the most capable and the most committed were accepted. Men who wished to join the Fianna had to undergo trials that tested not only their physical prowess but also their character and their intellect. They had to be able to move through forests as silently as shadows, to read the signs left by animals and other humans with accuracy and insight, to compose poetry and understand the deep mysteries of the land and the otherworld, to fight with skill and determination without hesitation, and yet to show mercy when it was warranted. The Fianna valued not just strength but wisdom, not just courage but compassion. The life of the Fianna was structured in a way that reflected the natural rhythms of the Irish countryside and the seasonal patterns of life in pre-Christian Ireland. During the harsh winter months, when the land was bound in cold and survival was difficult, the Fianna would disperse from their gathering places to noble houses and fortresses throughout Ireland, where they would be provided with food, shelter, and warmth in exchange for their protection and the maintenance of law and order within those territories. This arrangement allowed both the Fianna and the nobility to survive the difficult season. But when spring arrived and the earth began its renewal, when the forests returned to vibrant life and the hunting became good, when the wildflowers bloomed across the meadows and streams ran clear and cold from the mountains, the Fianna would gather once more and take to the wild places. They would hunt the great red deer that roamed the mountains and forests, compose poetry on the summits of hills where the wind carried their voices into the sky, engage in contests of skill and strength that tested their abilities, and undertake adventures that would be remembered and retold for generations to come, becoming the very substance of legend itself. The Fianna engaged in hunting that was more than mere sport or the simple procurement of food. When they pursued the great stag through misty valleys and across moonlit clearings, They understood themselves to be participants in an ancient ritual that connected the human world with the world of nature and the spirit realms beyond ordinary perception. Their hunting was guided by a profound respect for the creatures they pursued, and the legends tell us that they understood the language of animals in ways that mortals today can scarcely imagine, could read the messages written in the movements of birds and the tracks of beasts, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to navigate the wild lands of their country even in darkness and mist. Fianna was accompanied on many of his adventures by companions whose individual deeds would have made any of them famous in their own right if they had lived in different circumstances or belonged to different bands. There was Niamh, the warrior known for his supernatural beauty, blessed and cursed by the love he inspired in all who beheld him. There was Celtic Otherworld, renowned for his ability to move with such speed that he seemed to fly rather than run through forests and across fields, and also for his extraordinary gift with words and poetry. There was Gol Macmorna, at times Fianna's rival and at times his ally, representing the complex political and personal dynamics that characterized relationships within the warrior band. And then there was Oscar, Fianna's grandson and the son of Oisín, a warrior of such ferocity and prowess that legends say he was the strongest of all the Fianna and could defeat any opponent in single combat, possessing a courage that was matched only by his loyalty to his family. The Fianna were not separate from the people they protected, nor were they merely military tools used by kings for their own purposes. Rather, they were deeply woven into the fabric of Irish society, and the relationship between the warriors and the nobility they served was one of mutual respect and interdependence. The Fianna carried within them the stories and the history of Ireland. They understood themselves to be the guardians not merely of physical safety, but of cultural memory, the keepers of traditions and wisdom that stretched back into ages past. When they gathered, they told stories of their deeds, composed poems, sang songs, and through these acts, they kept alive the traditions and wisdom of their ancestors. In many ways, the Fianna represented an ideal of Irish manhood, an integration of physical prowess, intellectual achievement, artistic sensitivity, and moral integrity. The origins of Oisín, a faun born of magic and sorrow. Before we can truly appreciate Oisín the warrior and poet, before we can understand the depth of his longing when he found himself far from home, we must know his beginning, a beginning unlike that of ordinary men, a birth that itself was marked by the intervention of magic and the complications of the heart, by sorrow and sacrifice and a love that transcended all obstacles. Oisín's mother was a woman named Sab, whose beauty was legendary even among the extraordinary women of her time. Her name itself meant a doe in the Irish language, fitting for a woman whose destiny would intertwine with transformation and the wild places of the world. Sab was not merely beautiful in her physical form. She possessed a grace and a kindness that drew people to her as naturally as flowers turn toward the sun. It is said that her eyes held the light of distant stars and that her voice, when she spoke, was like music drifting across still water, capable of moving the hearts of all who heard it. But beauty and goodness in the ancient world often attracted the attention of those who would seek to exploit them for their own purposes. Such was the case with a druid named Fianna, whose name translated to the Dark Man, and in his darkness, he harbored desires that Sab could not and would not fulfill. Fianna, for all his knowledge of the old ways and his mastery of druidic magic, could not accept refusal. He could not comprehend that a woman might choose not to be with him, and in his wounded pride and his dark intentions, he chose to take from Sab the one thing that made her most completely herself. Through his druidic arts, working magic that was cruel and twisted in its purpose, he transformed her, working a terrible enchantment that stripped away her human form and left in its place a young and delicate deer, a fawn trembling with confusion and fear as her understanding of the world shattered and reformed around her new existence. To be transformed thus was not merely a change in outward appearance. Those who were cursed by such magic found themselves struggling against animal instinct even as they retained human consciousness, caught in a torment between two natures that could not be reconciled. Sadb, caught between two worlds, her human mind trapped within a faun's body, fled into the forests, running blindly through valleys and across mountains, her new form driving her to seek the company of the herds even as her human soul cried out in anguish and bewilderment at what had happened to her. The legend tells us that it was during a hunting expedition in the lands near Loch Lean that Fionn McCool encountered this extraordinary deer. Now, Fionn was renowned throughout Ireland for his hunting prowess, but he was also known for his mercy and his ability to recognize when something was not as it appeared to be on the surface. His legendary hunting hounds, Bran and Seolang, were no ordinary dogs in any conventional sense. These companions had once been human, enchanted into canine form through magic, and they retained within their dogs' hearts and minds the memory of humanity, the understanding of what it meant to be more than merely animal. When they encountered the doe that was Sadb, something in their transformed nature recognized something in hers. Rather than attacking, as any normal hounds would have done, driven by hunting instinct and the desire to bring down prey, they began to run not toward but away from her, protecting her from the hunters who pursued, their ancient human consciousness overriding their animal nature. Fionn, understanding through this strange behavior of his beloved hounds that something extraordinary was occurring, something beyond the ordinary realm of hunting and warfare, ceased the hunt and approached with curiosity rather than aggression. He looked into the eyes of the fawn, and in that gaze, he saw not animal but suffering, confusion, and a plea for help that transcended species and form. Fionn brought the transformed Sadb to his home, a place imbued with his own power and presence, protected by magic and by the force of his personality. And within the protective boundaries of his lands, a miracle occurred. The druidic curse, it seemed, could maintain its hold only in the wild places where Fianna's power extended naturally, in forests and plains beyond the reach of Fionn's protective influence. Within Fionn's protected dwelling, Sadb gradually returned to her true form, the transformation reversing as though it were a nightmare from which she was awakening, the fawn's body giving way to human form once more. When Sadb's human form returned fully to her, a profound gratitude filled her heart, and she saw in Fionn something more than a rescuer. Fionn, for his part, found within this extraordinary woman not merely beauty but a kindred spirit, someone whose experiences had taught her compassion and whose character had been tested and proven true in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. Their love was not the sudden infatuation of those who know nothing of sorrow, but rather the deep connection that forms between two people who have each faced darkness and chosen to reach toward the light. Fionn and Sadb were married in a celebration that rippled through the lands of Ireland, and very quickly, Sadb found herself with child, carrying within her the seed of new life, a new generation that would carry forward the legacy of both parents. But the curse that had transformed her was far from finished exacting its price. Fianna, discovering that Sadb had been healed and was now with child by Fionn, returned with dark intentions burning in his heart like a forge fire. Using his mastery of druidic magic once more, he performed another terrible transformation. This time, Sadb, pregnant and vulnerable, was seized by the curse while Fionn was away defending his lands from external threats, called to duty that he could not avoid. Once again, she was transformed into a fawn, and once again, the human consciousness trapped within the animal form drove her to flee, to run blindly into the forests. But this time, there was an additional tragedy that deepened the sorrow. Within her transformed body, she carried a child, and the magical transformation affected not only her, but also the unborn life within her. When she finally gave birth in some hidden glen or shadowed forest clearing, it was not to a human child but to a fawn, a young male deer bearing within himself the legacy of his father's greatness and his mother's suffering. The years passed in the forests, and the fawn grew in the wild places, neither fully animal nor bearing the understanding that comes with human consciousness, yet possessing something that set him apart from the ordinary herds. When Bran and Seolang encountered the young deer during a hunt, they recognized in him something that called to their transformed human hearts. Rather than pursuing, they protected, and they led Fi on to discover his son in one of the most moving reunions preserved in the old stories. The child, transformed back into human form upon being brought into his father's protected lands, bore a name that reflected his unique and tender origins. Oisín, which means little deer or fawn, carried within his very name the memory of his mother's curse, the magic that had shaped his existence, and the suffering that both his parents had endured. But within him also lived the strength of Fianna and the grace of Sadb, and as he grew into manhood, he became one of the Fianna's most distinguished members, known not only for his prowess as a warrior, but also for his extraordinary gift with words and poetry. It is significant that Oisín's name carried within it the memory of his mother's transformation. For those who understood the old ways knew that names held power, that they shaped destiny and kept alive the stories of the past. Every time his name was spoken, it was a reminder of the magical and tragic circumstances of his birth, yet it was also a celebration of the fact that from sorrow and dark magic, beauty and strength had emerged. Oisín grew up deeply loved by his father, trained in all the skills that a member of the Fianna required, but he also inherited something else from his extraordinary origins, a sensitivity to the magical realms, a deep understanding of transformation, and a certain knowledge that his own existence had been forged in the intersection between the human world and the fairy world. As Oisín matured, he became one of the most revered members of the Fianna, a warrior of great skill and courage, but also and perhaps more importantly, he became renowned as a poet and a bard. Whereas other warriors might be remembered primarily for their strength in battle, Oisín was celebrated for his ability to capture the essence of experience in words, to weave together strands of narrative into stories that would outlive all the swords and shields ever made. His poetry became the means by which the deeds of the Fianna were preserved, by which the history of his people was kept alive. He was regarded as the keeper of memory, the voice through which the past spoke to the present and, eventually, to all future generations. It was this Oisín, born of magic and sorrow, trained in both the ways of war and the arts of poetry, deeply connected to his father and to the brotherhood of the Fianna, who would one day find his entire life transformed when he encountered a woman riding a white horse across the shores of Loch Lean. The fateful hunt, the day that would change everything. The day that would alter the trajectory of Oisín's entire existence began like any other day in the hunting seasons of the Fianna. The sun was bright in the Irish sky, and across the valleys and mountains, the air carried the scent of wild grasses and growing things. Loch Lean, one of the Great Lakes of Ireland, lay like a jewel in the county of Kerry, and it was here that Fionn McCool had gathered a hunting party, a group of the Fianna's finest warriors and companions, all seeking to enjoy the sport that defined their summer existence and to celebrate their bond of brotherhood through the ancient ritual of the hunt. Picture, if you will, the scene as it unfolded on that remarkable morning. The Fianna had pursued the great red deer through forests and across mountainsides, and by midday, having exerted themselves in joyful pursuit, they had settled themselves upon one of the many hills that overlooked the great lake. The warriors reclined in the way that those who are supremely confident in their strength and their place in the world might recline, comfortable in their bodies and in the knowledge that they were among the finest warriors Ireland had ever known. Some of them spoke in low voices about the deeds of the day, discussing the movement of the deer and the paths they had taken. Others gazed out across the water, letting their minds wander to the simple thoughts of those at peace. Still others contemplated the mysteries of the land and the ancient magic that hummed beneath everything in that green and wild country. Fionn McCool sat among them, a figure of natural authority and presence, his legendary status resting upon him as naturally as a cloak. The warriors around him felt honored to be in his company, to be counted among those whom he trusted and valued. And among these warriors was his son, Oisín, the poet and fighter, bearing the legacy of both his parents and the particular sensitivity that came from his unusual birth. It was then, in this moment of contentment and peace, that something extraordinary occurred. From the direction of the lake, where the waters stretched out beneath the bright sky, a sound reached their ears. It was the sound of hoofbeats, but not the hoofbeats of any ordinary horse. This sound carried with it a quality that made the warriors sit upright and attune all their senses to the approaching newcomer. The hoofbeats seemed almost to dance across the ground, and they approached not from any direction that held threat, but rather with an inevitability that suggested something fated, something written into the fabric of the day itself. As the source of the sound came into view, the warriors beheld a sight that would remain seared into the memory of all who witnessed it for the rest of their days. A horse, the color of fresh snow and moonlight, appeared before them, moving with a grace and a fluidity that seemed to defy the ordinary laws of movement. This was no ordinary steed, but a creature that bore the unmistakable marks of the otherworld, a horse fashioned from magic and starlight, one that moved with purpose and intelligence. And seated upon this magnificent creature was a woman, and it is here that the old stories begin to describe beauty in language that pushes the boundaries of ordinary words. Her name was Niamh, which means golden-headed Niamh or golden-haired Niamh, and according to the tales, she was royalty from Tír na nÓg, the land of the young, the mysterious realm that existed beyond the western edge of the known world. Some versions of the legend speak of her as the daughter of the king of Tír na nÓg, while other accounts suggest she was the daughter of Manannán mac Lir, the sea god himself, lending her an even more explicitly divine ancestry. Either way, she bore within her the mark of her high lineage and her connection to the otherworld. She wore a dress of such fineness and such richness that it seemed woven from pale blue silk and studded with stars, as though she had captured the night sky itself and fashioned it into garment. A crown rested upon her head, ornate and beautiful, marking her status as a princess of the otherworld. Her long hair, from which her name derived, fell about her in waves the color of spun gold, catching the light of the Irish sun in such a way that it seemed to glow with its own inner radiance. And her eyes, the old stories tell us, held the depth and the color of the ocean itself, reflecting both the joy and the sorrow that can be found in the depths of great waters. She was surrounded by an aura of light, a gentle luminescence that marked her as a being not entirely of the mortal realm. And as she approached the Fianna, it became clear to all present that this was a moment of significance, an arrival that carried with it the weight of destiny. The warriors, even these men of great courage and experience, felt something stir within them as they beheld this extraordinary vision. There was no threat in her appearance, no sense of danger, yet there was also a recognition that something was happening that was beyond the scope of ordinary experience, something that touched upon the magical nature of their world. Even the hunting hounds seemed to understand, for though they made no aggressive moves, they stood alert, as if witnessing something that transcended their understanding. It was Niamh herself who broke the profound silence that had fallen over the gathering. She called out, and her voice was like music, carrying with it a beauty and a clarity that seemed to resonate in the very air itself. She announced that she was Niamh of the golden hair, daughter of the royalty of Tír na nÓg, and that she had travelled across the great waters, across the mists that separated the mortal realm from the otherworld, specifically to find one man. She had heard, she explained, tales of a great warrior named Oisín, stories of his courage and his skill, reports of his artistry with words and his nobility of character, and these tales had captured her heart even before she had ever beheld him with her own eyes. Oisín, hearing his name spoken by this creature of magic and beauty, felt something stir within his chest, something that the old stories describe as both a recognition and a drawing together of two beings who were meant to find each other. The moment their eyes met, It is said that a connection formed between them, immediate and undeniable, a knowing that moved beyond the ordinary understanding that develops between two people over time. It was as if, in that single glance, they recognized in each other something fundamental, something that spoke to the deepest parts of their beings. Niamh extended an invitation to Oisín, not expressed as a command or a test, but offered as a gift, as an opportunity for adventure and for a love that transcended the ordinary boundaries of the mortal world. She described Tír na nÓg in language that painted pictures in the minds of those who heard it, speaking of a realm where no one aged, where no one knew sorrow or pain, where beauty was eternal and joy was the fundamental condition of existence. She painted a vision of herself and Oisín together in that magical land, suggesting a future of love and adventure and a kind of happiness that was rarely found in the mortal realm where time brought decay and aging and the inevitable diminishment of all things. Fianna watched his son, and though he must have felt the weight of a father's natural concern at seeing his beloved child drawn toward the unknown, he understood that what was occurring was something beyond his power to prevent or control. This was a meeting that belonged to destiny itself, a convergence of two paths that had been written in the stars and in the deep magic of Ireland long before this day had arrived. Oisín, torn between the love he bore for his father and the Fianna, and the overwhelming pull of what he felt in the presence of Niamh, made a choice that would reverberate through the centuries. He agreed to accompany Niamh, though he promised that he would return soon to see his father and his brothers in arms. With a heart full of emotion, acknowledging the sacrifice he was making and the love that bound him to his people, Oisín mounted the magical white horse that bore Niamh, and as he did so, he became irrevocably separated from the world he had always known. The last image those who remained had of him was a hand raised in farewell, a final gesture of love toward the father and the companions he was leaving behind, before Niamh turned the white horse toward the western waters and they began their journey into the unknown. The journey across enchanted waters, crossing between worlds. What followed next in the legend of Oisín was a journey unlike any that could be undertaken in the ordinary world, a passage across waters and through mists that separated the realm of mortals from the otherworld itself. To understand this journey is to grasp something fundamental about the nature of the Celtic concept of the otherworld, a realm that existed not necessarily in space but rather in a different dimension of being, accessible to mortals only through magic or through invitation. The white horse upon which both Oisín and Niamh now rode was not confined by the limitations that bound ordinary steeds. This creature, called Embar and said to be a gift from the sea god Manannan mac Lir himself, possessed the remarkable ability to travel not merely across land, but across water as if it were solid ground. As Oisín and Niamh rode from the shores of Loch Lean and urged the horse toward the west, toward the setting sun and the vast Atlantic Ocean that stretched beyond, they found that the waters beneath the horse's hooves became as firm as stone, allowing their passage without resistance or danger. The journey was not instantaneous, for in the old stories, even magic has its own time frame and its own particular properties. For what seemed to be 3 days and nights, or perhaps longer in a way that defied ordinary measurement, Oisín found himself traveling across seas that seemed to exist between the worlds. The sky above took on qualities that were neither entirely of the day nor entirely of the night, but rather a kind of eternal twilight, a glow that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. The waters through which they passed were sometimes placid and mirror-like, reflecting the strange sky above with perfect clarity, and sometimes turbulent and storm-tossed, yet never threatening, never suggesting any real danger to those who rode upon their surface. As they journeyed, Oisín began to perceive things that suggested he was no longer in the ordinary world. Sometimes they passed through banks of mist so thick that he could see neither the waters beneath the horse nor the sky above, yet the horse continued with perfect confidence, never faltering, never losing its way. Within the mist, Oisín heard sounds that were not the sounds of the mortal world. There were voices, some melodious and inviting, others distant and strange, speaking in languages that were both familiar and utterly foreign, as if the old language of Ireland itself was transformed and elevated into something more resonant and more meaningful. Throughout this journey, Niamh remained at his side, her presence comforting and stabilizing in the midst of strangeness. She explained to him the nature of the passage they were making, describing how the journey across the waters was itself a kind of transformation, a gradual shifting from the understanding of the mortal world into the understanding of the other world. She spoke of how time moved differently on either side of the boundary, of how the laws and limitations that governed the lands of mortals did not apply in the same way in the realm to which they were traveling. Oisín asked questions, and Niamh answered them with patience and affection, her voice carrying always a note of gentle amusement at the wonder that he experienced. She prepared him for what he would find, describing in detail the nature of Tír na nÓg and the extraordinary experiences that awaited him. She spoke of a realm where the landscape was forever preserved in the beauty of eternal spring, where the flowers never faded and the trees never lost their leaves unless they chose to. She described the inhabitants of this magical land, the Tuatha De Danann, the divine race that had once ruled Ireland in the ancient days and who had retreated to this realm when the mortal Milesians conquered the land, establishing their own dominion. The Tuatha De Danann, Niamh explained, were not merely immortal beings who had happened to achieve great age. Rather, they were fundamentally different in their nature from mortal humans. They possessed powers that allowed them to shape reality according to their will, to command the forces of nature, to work magic that mortals could barely comprehend. Yet despite these great powers, they had chosen to govern themselves by principles of beauty and wisdom. In the great hall where the king of Tír na nÓg held court, there was a celebration that never entirely ceased, a great feast where the air itself seemed to sparkle with eternal joy. As they traveled, Oisín noticed that he himself was beginning to change. The weariness that any mortal would feel after extended travel seemed to lift from him. The hunger and thirst that should have plagued him did not arise. His senses became sharper, more acute, able to perceive things that had been invisible to him before. It was as though, with each moment that passed as they traveled across the enchanted waters, he was gradually shedding the limitations of his mortal nature and taking on something different, something more aligned with the nature of the realm toward which they journeyed. At last, after what seemed both like an instant and like an eternity, the mists began to clear. The waters beneath the horses' hooves became visible once more, and beyond them, Oisín perceived land rising up from the sea. It was unlike any landscape he had ever beheld, though it possessed a familiarity that spoke to something deep within his memory, or perhaps to something beyond his personal memory, to an ancestral knowledge of places that existed beyond time. The wonders of Tír na nÓg, a realm beyond mortal imagination. As they approached the shores of Tír na nÓg, Oisín felt within his breast a kind of overwhelming emotion that was at once recognition and discovery, as if he was returning to a place he had always known and simultaneously arriving in a place entirely new. The moment the white horse touched solid ground, and Oisín stepped down from his back, he found himself in a landscape that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light, a place where beauty was not merely present but seemed to be the fundamental principle upon which reality itself was constructed. The sky above was perpetually that shade of blue that exists only in memory and in dreams, a blue so perfect that it seemed almost unreal, as though one could reach up and touch it and find that it was made of something solid and precious. And this sky bore within it no clouds, or rather, it bore clouds that were themselves works of art, sculptured by winds that understood beauty and formed themselves into shapes of exquisite grace and meaning. The sun that illuminated this realm hung above at an angle that suggested it was always either dawn or sunset, that eternal golden hour when the light becomes soft and everything it touches is transformed into something touched by grace. The landscape stretched out before Oisín in all directions, and it was a landscape that seemed to embody every beautiful element that the mortal world could offer, while purifying each of these elements to a degree of perfection that surpassed anything that existed in the lands of mortals. There were mountains, but their peaks touched clouds that were like silk, and their slopes were covered with forests of trees that possessed a luminescence all their own. These were not forests twisted by age or hardship, but forests in eternal youth, their leaves displaying all the colors of spring and summer simultaneously, gold and green and every shade between. Beyond the mountains, Oisín could perceive vast plains that stretched to the horizon, lands covered with flowers of such breathtaking variety and color that the mind had difficulty taking in the profusion of beauty. The flowers seemed to bloom in a state of perpetual perfection, never wilting, never fading, their colors more vivid and more nuanced than any that could exist in the mortal world. Meadows of these flowers rolled like waves across the landscape, and interspersed among them were streams and small waterfalls, the water of which was so clear that it seemed almost to be liquid light rather than ordinary water. The architecture that Oisín now perceived within this landscape was equally extraordinary. There were castles and halls, yes, but they were constructed according to principles of beauty and harmony that seemed to transcend the practical concerns that guided building in the mortal world. The structures seemed to grow organically out of the landscape itself, as if they were not built upon the land, but were rather an expression of the land's own will to take form. The walls shimmered with colors that seemed to shift and change as light touched them, and the towers rose to heights that seemed almost to touch the sky itself. Windows in these structures glowed with a soft radiance, as if fires of extraordinary purity burned within. Niamh led Oisín through this landscape, and as they walked, they encountered inhabitants of this extraordinary realm. These were the Tuatha de Danann, the divine race of Celtic mythology, and they were beings whose very nature seemed to embody the qualities of beauty, wisdom, and a kind of ageless vitality. They appeared in forms that were humanoid but seemed to possess a quality of light within them, as if their very substance was infused with something beyond ordinary matter. Some of them appeared as warriors of extraordinary power, bearing weapons that glowed within a fire. Others appeared as artists and musicians, playing instruments of such transcendent beauty that the sound of their playing seemed to permeate the very air itself, making everything it touched more beautiful and more alive. The inhabitants of Tír na nÓg moved with a grace and a purpose that suggested they were engaged in pursuits that mattered deeply to them. Yet there was no urgency or stress in their movements. They seemed to be perpetually engaged in activities of creation and celebration, in music and art and the refinement of beauty. Groups of them gathered in the great halls, and Oisín could perceive that even their conversation seemed to be a form of music, a dance of words and ideas that flowed together with perfect harmony. As Niamh and Oisín approached one of the great castles, the largest and most magnificent of those Oisín had yet perceived, the doors seemed to open of their own accord, welcoming them. Inside, Oisín found himself in a hall so vast and so beautiful that his eyes could barely take in all its aspects simultaneously. The walls were adorned with carvings and with artifacts that spoke of cultures and achievements from epochs beyond counting. The floor seemed to be made of a material that was neither quite stone nor quite crystal, and it reflected the light in such a way that walking across it was like walking across the surface of a perfectly still lake. And in the center of this great hall, Oisín beheld a sight that seemed to represent the very heart and essence of Tír na nÓg. There was a table that stretched for what seemed like an impossible distance, laden with foods and drinks of every imaginable variety. The array was not merely extensive but seemed to be infinite, as if no matter what one's appetite or desire, it could be satisfied from this unending bounty. And hovering above this table, suspended in the air as if by magic, was the cauldron of plenty itself, a vessel of such antiquity and such beauty that merely to gaze upon it was to feel the presence of ages and powers beyond mortal understanding. In the legends of Tír na nÓg, this great feast was said to hold within it a protective power, a magic that granted those who partook of it the blessing of eternal youth and freedom from the ravages of time and age. The king of Tír na nÓg himself was present in this great hall, a figure of commanding presence and extraordinary beauty, with hair that seemed to be spun from silver and eyes that held the wisdom of ages. He welcomed Oisín with courtesy and with warmth, and he made it clear that this newcomer, brought to their realm by Niamh, was honored and valued. There was a celebration, a great feast, and Oisín found himself surrounded by beings of extraordinary nature, all of whom seemed to be genuinely interested in him and in learning about the world from which he had come. Music played continuously throughout the great hall, music of such transcendent beauty that Oisín found himself moved to tears by the sheer perfection and emotional depth of what he heard. The musicians played harps and other instruments whose names and purposes he did not entirely understand, and they played melodies that seemed to reach into the deepest parts of his being and touch something fundamental about the nature of existence itself. The music seemed to convey emotions and truths that could never be fully expressed in words, and yet it felt as familiar to him as his own heartbeat, as if somewhere deep within his nature, he had always known and loved this music. As the days passed, or what seemed like days in a realm where the distinction between night and day was not clearly demarcated, Oisín explored more fully the wonders of Tír na nÓg. He discovered gardens where flowers that existed nowhere else grew in profusion, tended by beings who understood the language of plants and could encourage their growth through some form of communion that transcended ordinary gardening. He found great libraries where books and scrolls were preserved, holding within them knowledge and wisdom from epochs past and perhaps epochs yet to come. He spent time in the company of beings who were themselves living repositories of knowledge and experience. There were warriors who told him of ancient battles and great victories, and their stories were told with a kind of noble melancholy that suggested they remembered both the glory and the cost of what they had experienced. There were poets and musicians who spoke with him about the nature of beauty and truth, and who seemed to recognize in him a kindred spirit, another being who understood that the highest form of human achievement was the creation of beauty and the preservation of memory through art. Yet perhaps most significantly, there was Niamh. In the context of Tír na nÓg, with all distractions removed and all pressure and stress lifted from their shoulders, Oisín and Niamh's connection deepened and transformed into something profound. They spent long periods together, walking through the eternal landscapes, sitting by streams and waterfalls, speaking to each other of their hopes and their dreams and their understandings of what it meant to exist and to love. Their love, which had begun in that moment of first encounter by Loch Lean, grew into something more substantial and more meaningful, a union of two beings who had found in each other a completion that they had not even known they were seeking. Love and timelessness, a life lived in the land of eternal youth. In the blessed land of Tír na nÓg, Oisín and Niamh were joined together in marriage, a ceremony that took place in the great hall of the king and was attended by all the inhabitants of that magical realm. The celebration lasted for what seemed like days, though in that place where time moved differently, the duration was difficult to measure. Music and feasting and joy filled the great halls, and the Tuatha De Danann, in their benevolence and their understanding of love, celebrated this union between the warrior from the mortal realm and their beloved princess with genuine happiness and warmth. After the wedding, Oisín and Niamh were given a dwelling of their own, a castle within the greater landscape of Tír na nÓg, a place where they could build a life together away from the constant celebrations and activities of the Great Hall, yet still connected to the wider community of the other world. This dwelling was as beautiful and as perfectly maintained as all the other structures in that realm, with rooms that seemed to respond to the inhabitants' needs and desires, with windows that opened onto vistas of perpetual beauty and perfection. In this dwelling, Oisín and Niamh began their life together, and it is in this period that the legend speaks of a kind of happiness so complete and so perfect that it transcended the ordinary understanding of what happiness could be. Oisín, who had spent his entire life in the mortal realm knowing the inevitable passage of time, the constant awareness that all things must eventually pass away and fade into the past, found himself in a state where that fundamental anxiety was lifted. Here, in Tír na nÓg, he was able to experience love and joy without the shadow of impending loss hanging over him. Niamh was a companion in the fullest sense, not merely a lover but a teacher and a guide as well. She helped Oisín acclimate to the nature of existence in Tír na nÓg, to understand how to navigate a reality that operated according to principles fundamentally different from those of the mortal world. She introduced him more deeply to the inhabitants of the realm, and she helped him to appreciate and to understand the sophisticated culture and achievements of the Tuatha De Danann. Within a short time, by the reckoning of the mortal world, though in Tír na nÓg the temporal markers were different, Oisín and Niamh were blessed with children. They had a son who was given the name Oscar, inheriting the name from his grandfather though in a different context and in a different realm. This child bore within him the legacy of both his parents, combining the strength and the nobility of his father with the grace and the magical nature of his mother. He was raised in Tír na nÓg, growing strong and beautiful, and it was said that even among the Tuatha De Danann, his youth and vitality were remarked upon with admiration. They also had a daughter, called Niamh, which means flower of women, and she was a creature of such beauty and such sweetness that her very presence seemed to bring joy to all who encountered her. In addition, Oisín and Niamh had another son, also named Finn in honor of Oisín's great father, and he too grew in strength and in the understanding of the ways of Tír na nÓg. These children represented the blending of two worlds, the union of mortal and divine, and they were cherished by all who knew them. The existence that Oisín and Niamh shared with their children was one of profound contentment and joy. They were not idle or inactive, as might be expected in a realm where want and suffering were unknown. Rather, they pursued activities that engaged their higher natures and their creative impulses. Oisín, in this realm where magic was as natural as breathing and where the limitations that had governed his mortal existence were lifted, found that his poetic nature flourished. He composed verses of extraordinary beauty, using the experiences and the beauty of Tír na nÓg as his subject matter. His poetry was sung and celebrated throughout the realm, and the inhabitants of Tír na nÓg recognized in him a master of the art. Oisín also engaged in activities of a more martial nature, training and sparring with the great warriors of the Tuatha De Danann. Though he was engaged in combat with beings whose powers and whose martial skills were in many ways superior to his own, he found that his experience as a member of the Fianna served him well. He learned new forms of combat and new ways of understanding warfare, and he earned the respect and the friendship of the great warriors of the other world. Niamh, meanwhile, participated more fully in the governance and the cultural activities of the realm. She was a princess and would perhaps one day be queen, and she took her responsibilities seriously while also finding time to be a devoted wife and mother. She and Oisín would often walk together through the gardens and the forests, or sit by the great waterfalls, speaking about their life together and about the experiences they were sharing. On some evenings, they would attend celebrations in the Great Hall, where Oisín would join in the music making or the storytelling, contributing his own perspective and his own understanding to the ongoing cultural life of the realm. The children grew strong and beautiful in the nurturing environment of Tír na nÓg. Oscar, in particular, seemed to inherit his father's warrior nature along with something of his mother's magical lineage, and he became increasingly skilled in all the martial arts. Niamh developed into a woman of extraordinary grace and wisdom, and young Finn showed early signs of being both a warrior and a poet, much like his father. During all of this time, Oisín was aware, on some level of his consciousness, of the passage of time in the mortal realm. Niamh had explained to him early on that time moved differently in Tír na nÓg, that what might seem like a few years to him would be a much longer span of time in the world he had left behind. But this knowledge was abstract, not emotionally immediate. And as the happiness of his life in the otherworld deepened, and as his children were born and grew and flourished, Oisín found it increasingly easy to allow that knowledge to recede into the background of his awareness. In many ways, Oisín's existence in Tír na nÓg represented the fulfillment of dreams that might have seemed impossible to achieve in the mortal realm. He had love without fear of loss, beauty without decay, youth without the aging that brought weakness and diminishment, creativity without the constraints of poverty or social limitation. Every desire that his heart could form was easily satisfied, and there were always new experiences to be explored and new forms of beauty to be appreciated. Yet human hearts, even the hearts of men living in paradise, are complex and contradictory in their natures. And within Oisín's heart, gradually, over what he perceived as years but what may have been much longer in the reckoning of his old world, a gentle longing began to develop. The sweetness of 3 years that were 3 centuries. The strange temporal magic of Tír na nÓg operated in such a way that time seemed to pass differently depending on one's perspective. Oisín, living in the midst of the eternal beauty and perfect contentment of the otherworld, perceived that he had dwelt there for what he calculated to be approximately 3 years. 3 years is a significant span of time, enough for a man to fully acclimate to a new environment and to build a life and establish memories, yet not so long that it necessarily feels like an eternity. 3 years seemed, to Oisín's reckoning, to be an appropriate amount of time to have spent in paradise, to have loved and been loved, to have fathered children and seen them grow into childhood. Yet in the mortal realm, in the lands of Ireland that Oisín had left behind, a vastly different calculation of time had been unfolding. The 3 years that had passed in Oisín's experience had corresponded to 300 years in the world he had left behind. 3 centuries, a span of time sufficient for the entire nature of a civilization to transform, for the old ways to give way entirely to new ways, for all the people whom Oisín had known and loved to age and pass into death, and for their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren to do the same, until the world to which he had belonged seemed, to those who still inhabited it, to be merely legend and myth. Stories told about impossible ages when the world was young and giants walked the earth. But Oisín, in his dwelling in Tír na nÓg, surrounded by beauty and comfort and love, was largely unaware of this vast passage of time. The knowledge that time moved differently in Tír na nÓg had been conveyed to him by Niamh early in their relationship, but the true meaning of it, the visceral understanding of what it meant, seemed to strike him with full force only gradually, as subtle longings began to arise within his heart. The whisper of homesickness, longing across the boundaries of time. It was a gradual thing, this longing that began to grow within Oisín's heart, not a sudden and overwhelming desire, but rather a gentle ache that would sometimes catch him unawares. Based on what we know from the legend, we can understand that it was perhaps born from the very nature of memory itself, from the consciousness that he carried within him of a world and people he had left behind. It might come to him on an evening when he was walking with Niamh through the gardens of Tír na nÓg, the gardens where flowers of impossible beauty bloomed in eternal spring. They would be walking together, perfectly content, and then Oisín might catch a scent on the wind, or he might see the light falling across the landscape in a particular way, and suddenly his memory would be transported back to the green hills of Kerry, to the shores of Loch Lean where he had spent so many happy days hunting with the Fianna. Or he might be composing poetry, creating verses that captured the beauty of Tír na nÓg, and suddenly, without entirely intending to, his words would turn toward memories of the mortal world. He would find himself composing verses about hunting expeditions through Irish forests, about the particular quality of light in the Irish sky on an autumn afternoon, about the way the Fianna would gather around their fires and tell stories of their deeds and their lives. It was the Fianna that drew at his heart most powerfully. He thought often of his father, Fionn MacCool, that great and noble warrior who had raised him and trained him in the ways of the Fianna. He thought of the other warriors who had been his companions, Celtic Otherworld and Niamh, and all the others whose names had been inscribed in his memory through years of shared adventures and shared bonds. He wondered whether his father still lived, whether the great leader of the Fianna had aged and eventually passed into whatever lay beyond life, or whether, through some magic or some particular favor, he had been granted a longer span of years. He thought of his descendants if they had been born to the warriors he had known, and he felt a particular ache when he contemplated that all these people were now long dead, that centuries had passed in which their children's children had been born and had themselves aged and died, and now only memory remained. Niamh began to notice this wistful quality that had entered into her husband's nature. She saw how his eyes would sometimes grow distant, how he would pause in his activities and gaze out toward the horizon, as if looking back through time itself toward a realm he had left behind. And because Niamh loved Oisín with a depth of feeling that transcended her own happiness, she began to contemplate whether keeping him in Tír na nÓg against the yearnings of his heart was ultimately an act of love or of a more subtle form of cruelty. The decision that Niamh came to was not made lightly, and there was profound sorrow intertwined with whatever love and sacrifice it represented. She approached Oisín one evening, when they were alone together, away from the celebrations and the activities of the Great Hall, and she broached the subject that she had been contemplating. She acknowledged that she had perceived his longing, his gentle but persistent homesickness for the world he had left behind. She spoke to him of the 3 years that, in his perception, had passed since his arrival in Tír na nÓg, and she gently explained to him that these 3 years had corresponded to 300 years in the mortal realm. Oisín heard this information, and though he had been told at the beginning of his journey that time moved differently in Tír na nÓg, the true meaning of it, the visceral understanding of what it meant, seemed to strike him with full force only in this moment. 300 years. His father, who had been a man of great age and strength when Oisín left, would have long since passed into death and into legend. The Fianna as a body would likely have been dissolved or transformed beyond recognition. The world he knew would have become something else entirely, something that might bear the name of Ireland, but that would be fundamentally transformed by the passage of such an immense span of time. Yet even with this knowledge, the longing did not abate. If anything, it grew stronger, for Oisín understood now that every moment he remained in Tír na nÓg, more time was passing in the world he had left behind, more memories were fading, more of the threads that connected him to his past were being severed. And Niamh, understanding this, and understanding that to truly love someone is sometimes to allow them to leave, even when that leaving brings pain to one's own heart, made an offer. She would, she told Oisín, allow him to return to Ireland, to visit his homeland and his people and to see what remained of the world he had known. She would give him her own magical white horse, Embar, the creature that had carried them across the enchanted waters and that could move across water as easily as across land. But she placed upon this gift a condition, a restriction born of a deep understanding of the nature of Tír na nÓg and its magic. She explained to him that the magic that kept them young and preserved them from aging was intimately connected to the soil of Tír na nÓg itself, to the land and its inherent properties. As long as Oisín remained in the otherworld, that magic held him in its protective embrace, maintaining him in perpetual youth. But should he set foot upon the soil of Ireland, should his feet touch the earth of the mortal realm, that connection would be severed. The hundreds of years that he had not aged in the otherworld would catch up with him all at once, and he would instantly age into the withered and ancient man that he would naturally have become in the mortal realm. With this knowledge, Oisín was faced with a choice unlike any he had ever faced before. He could remain in Tír na nÓg, secure in his beauty and his youth, with his beloved Niamh and their children around him, in a realm where all his desires were fulfilled and where suffering and loss were unknown. Or he could return to the mortal realm, knowing that the moment his feet touched Irish soil, he would be transformed into an ancient man, perhaps dying shortly thereafter, certainly unable to fulfill any of the warrior's adventures he might imagine. It was not a choice that admitted of any easy resolution, for the loss in either case was profound. Yet Oisín's love for his people, his deep connection to his father and to the Fianna, his longing to see once more the lands of his birth and to understand what his world had become, overwhelmed even the fear of aging and death. He made the decision to return, not as a permanent departure but as a visit, a journey home to reconnect with his past and to understand what the centuries had wrought upon the land and the people he loved. Niamh wept when she understood that he had truly made this decision, and her tears were not tears of anger but tears of a woman who had loved deeply and had chosen to sacrifice her own happiness for the happiness of the one she loved. Yet there was also in her expression a kind of understanding, a recognition that some forms of love require the willingness to let go, even when letting go brings profound pain. She gave him the white horse, Embar, along with careful instructions and warnings. She emphasized again that he must not, under any circumstances, allow his feet to touch the earth of Ireland. She explained that as long as he remained mounted upon the horse, the protective magic of that creature would maintain a connection to Tír na nÓg, preserving him in his current state even as he traversed the mortal realm. But should he dismount, should he place even a single foot upon Irish soil, that connection would be severed and the centuries would claim him. The return to Ireland, a journey back through time. Oisín prepared for his return to the mortal realm with a heart that was divided between longing and dread. The longing to see his homeland once more, to walk upon Irish soil, to understand what had become of the Fianna and his people, was overwhelming. Yet the dread of what he might find, the awareness that centuries had passed and that everything he had known would have transformed almost beyond recognition, was equally profound. The journey back across the enchanted waters was performed in reverse, and it was perhaps even more wondrous than the first journey. For now Oisín understood what it meant to journey between worlds, to pass from one realm of being to another. The mists parted before the white horse, and the waters became visible, and the sky took on the qualities of transition, neither entirely of the otherworld nor entirely of the mortal realm, but rather existing in the threshold between them. At last, the white horse brought Oisín to the shores of Ireland, and when his eyes beheld once more the green hills of his homeland, something within his chest seemed to break open with emotion. This was the land of his birth, the realm where he had been raised, where he had become a man and a warrior and a poet. The basic geography was still recognizable, the mountains and the waters were still in their places, yet as Oisín looked more closely, he perceived that much had changed. The forests seemed less extensive than he remembered, the evidence of human habitation more widespread. The ancient fortresses that he had known seemed to have fallen into disrepair, or to have been replaced by structures that he did not recognize. Oisín urged the white horse toward the area where he most hoped to find remnants of the Fianna and of his father's line. He was searching for Loch Lean, the location where he had first encountered Niamh, and he imagined that even if centuries had passed, the ancient gathering places of the Fianna might still hold some significance. He rode through landscapes that were both familiar and strange, past settlements that seemed to have grown or transformed beyond recognition. The people he saw appeared dressed in garments he did not recognize, and when they noticed him riding past on his magical white horse, dressed in the style of ancient warriors, they seemed to regard him with a mixture of awe and fear, as if he were some apparition from ages past. As Oisín traveled, he questioned those he encountered, asking them about the Fianna and about Fionn McCool. But the responses he received were confusing and disheartening. The people spoke of the Fianna as though they were legendary beings from ages past, stories told to children about warriors who had lived hundreds of years ago. They spoke of Fionn McCool with a kind of respectful wonder, but also with a sense that he was a figure from mythology rather than from actual history. Some of them seemed uncertain whether such a person had ever actually existed, or whether he was merely the creation of storytellers. As Oisín travelled, he made his way toward the area near Loch Lean, and it was here, according to the legend, that he encountered a group of men who were struggling to move a large stone from the pathway they were constructing. In his compassion, and in his recognition of the universal human need for assistance, Oisín was moved to help them. He leaned down from his horse, forgetting in the moment of his desire to help the warning that Niamh had given him, forgetting the understanding that his life and his ability to remain in any form other than aged and withered depended upon his not touching the earth of Ireland. He reached out to help the men with the stone, intending merely to add his strength to theirs so that the burden might be eased. The fall from grace, instant aging, and the terrible truth. The moment came that Oisín had been warned about but had not entirely believed could come. The moment when the protective magic that had sustained him was shattered and the true price of his departure from Tír na nÓg was extracted. As he leaned from the horse to assist the men with their stone, his saddle girth broke, the leather giving way, and Oisín found himself tumbling from the horse's back. What occurred next was not a gradual process but a devastating and instantaneous transformation. The moment Oisín's feet touched the earth of Ireland, all the years that he had not aged in Tír na nÓg, all the 300 years that had passed in the mortal realm while he had remained young and vital, descended upon him at once. The magic that had preserved him was torn away in an instant, and the centuries claimed him with a kind of terrible finality. Those who witnessed what occurred reported later that they saw something almost unbelievable. A man who had been riding the magical white horse, a man who appeared to be in the full vigor of youth, was suddenly transformed before their eyes into an ancient and withered figure, bent with age, his hair turning white, his skin becoming thin and papery, his body shrunken and weakened. It was as though the aging that should have occurred over 300 years happened all at once, compressing centuries of decay into the space of a moment. Oisín fell to the ground, his ancient body unable to bear the shock of what had occurred. The men who had been struggling with the stone cried out in horror and astonishment, and they rushed to help the ancient figure who had fallen. But even as they did, they seemed uncertain whether what they had witnessed was real or some form of illusion or magical trickery. The white horse, Embar, suddenly seemed to shift its attention away from Oisín, as if the magic that had bound it to its task had been completed and severed. The creature turned and began to move away from Oisín, and witnesses reported that it seemed to fade back into the otherworld itself, returning to Tír na nÓg, its mission of bringing Oisín home completed. Oisín lay upon the earth, gasping, his ancient lungs struggling with each breath, his weakened body overwhelmed by the shock of the transformation. As his mind slowly adjusted to what had occurred, the full realization of the situation crashed down upon him. He was old now, 300 years old in body if not in subjective experience. His strength was gone. His youth was gone. Even if he survived this moment, even if the shock did not kill him, he was now an ancient man in a world 3 centuries removed from the world he had known. The meeting with St. Patrick, when the old world encounters the new. The story of Oisín's return to Ireland, the arrival of this ancient warrior who spoke of things that had occurred centuries ago, eventually reached the ears of a man named Patrick, a figure who had come to Ireland in the time of its transformation, and who would come to be known as St. Patrick, the Apostle of Ireland. The man credited with bringing Christianity to the island and converting the people from their ancient pagan beliefs to the new monotheistic faith that was spreading across Europe. St. Patrick was a remarkable figure in his own right, a man who had himself been captured and enslaved in Ireland during his youth, who had escaped, and who had then devoted his life to returning to the land of his captivity in order to bring it salvation through the Christian faith. He was a man of faith and determination, a man who believed deeply in the truth of his mission, and who was willing to undertake extraordinary efforts to bring his message to the Irish people. When Patrick heard of the ancient man who claimed to have lived 300 years in the magical land of Tír na nÓg, he saw in this an opportunity. Here, he believed, was a pagan from an ancient age, someone whose very existence seemed to embody the old ways that he was working to supplant with Christian faith. Patrick believed that if he could convert this ancient warrior, if he could bring him to accept Christ and Christianity before the man died, it would be a powerful demonstration of the superiority of the Christian faith over the old pagan ways. Patrick made his way to where Oisín was being cared for, and when he arrived, he was confronted with a figure that seemed almost to embody the tragedy of ages. Oisín was ancient beyond measure, his body racked with the weakness and the pain that accompanies extreme age, his eyes still bright with intelligence and memory even as his body failed. Yet despite his condition, Oisín retained his eloquence and his ability to speak with passion and conviction about the world he had known and the experiences he had had. What occurred between St. Patrick and Oisín was a meeting of two worlds, the meeting of the old pagan Ireland and the new Christian Ireland. But it was a meeting that was not characterized primarily by hostility, but rather by a kind of tragic mutual understanding. Patrick listened to Oisín's stories about the Fianna and about Fianna, and the old warrior told him of adventures and battles and the codes of honor by which the ancient warriors had lived. Oisín spoke to Patrick of poetry and beauty and the love that existed between the members of the Fianna, and he spoke with particular tenderness of his love for Niamh and for the realm of Tír na Nog. Patrick, for his part, attempted to convert Oisín to Christianity, explaining to him that in the Christian heaven, there was eternal life and eternal joy, a realm not unlike Tír na Nog in many respects, but one that was governed by a single God and by the teachings of Christ. Patrick promised Oisín that if he would accept Christ and be baptized before his death, his soul would be saved and he would experience an eternity of peace and joy in the presence of God. But Oisín's response to Patrick's message was complicated and deeply emotional. He listened to what Patrick said, and he did not reject it entirely, yet he could not fully embrace it either. In his heart, he remained loyal to the old ways and to the memory of those he had loved. When Patrick spoke to him of heaven and of salvation through Christ, Oisín's thoughts turned instead to the Fianna, to his father Fianna and to his companions, and he questioned whether they would be in Patrick's Christian heaven. Would the memory of his father, who had lived and died in a world before Christ came to Ireland, be honored in this new faith? Would the great deeds that Fianna and the Fianna had accomplished be recognized and celebrated, or would they be forgotten, dismissed as the foolish acts of pagan barbarians? The legends preserve various accounts of the interactions between Patrick and Oisín, and in some of these accounts, there is a kind of deep and genuine conflict. Oisín challenged Patrick's faith, suggesting that the Christian God could not be as powerful as Patrick claimed, for if he were so powerful, surely he could defeat Oscar, Oisín's son, in single combat. Oisín's loyalty to his family, even to members who were no longer alive in the mortal realm, was so strong that he could not conceive of accepting a faith that might seem to diminish the memory of those he loved. Patrick, according to some accounts, was moved by Oisín's loyalty and his questioning. He seems to have recognized in this ancient warrior something noble and something true, even if it was not compatible with his own faith. And in some versions of the legend, Patrick experienced a revelation or a profound spiritual moment in which he was made to understand that the God he served could indeed honor the souls of those who had lived in ages before Christ, that the Fianna could find a place even in the Christian conception of the afterlife, thanks to the very loyalty and devotion that Oisín himself displayed. In any case, the two men came to a kind of peace with each other, if not a full agreement on matters of faith. Patrick cared for Oisín in his final days, and according to the legend, he did eventually baptize the ancient warrior before his death, ensuring that the last pagan hero of Ireland would be received into the Christian conception of the afterlife. Whether this occurred due to Oisín's ultimate acceptance of the faith or due to Patrick's own merciful understanding that a loyal heart could find salvation even outside of the formal structures of the Christian Church is not entirely clear from the legend. But what is clear is that the two men developed a relationship of genuine mutual respect, even as they disagreed about fundamental matters of faith and theology. Legacy and gentle memories, the preservation of the ancient tales. Oisín's death came not long after his return to Ireland. His ancient body, shocked by the trauma of the instantaneous aging and weakened by the centuries of existence compressed into a mortal frame, could not long endure. But before he passed, while he still had breath enough to speak and clarity enough to remember, Oisín told his stories to Patrick and to those who gathered around to listen. He spoke of the Fianna and of Fionn McCool, recounting the great deeds and the adventures of his father and his companions. He spoke of individual warriors and of specific battles, of poetry and music and the deep bonds of brotherhood that had characterized the warrior band. He told stories of love and of loss, of loyalty and of sacrifice, and he described with vivid detail the beauty and the wonder of Tír na nÓg, the realm where he had spent 3 years that were 3 centuries. And most importantly, he spoke of Niamh, of his love for her and his memories of their time together. He described her beauty in language so tender and so precise that those who heard him were moved to tears, even those who had never known her and who were separated from her world by the barriers between realms. Oisín's love for Niamh was evident in every word he spoke of her, and his longing for her, even at the end of his life when reunion was impossible, gave his words a poignancy that transcended the merely personal and became something universal, something that spoke to the eternal human experience of love and separation. Patrick, recognizing the profound value of what he was hearing, according to the legends, sought to preserve Oisín's words for posterity. Whether Patrick himself wrote them down, dictated them to scribes, or whether the stories were preserved through an oral tradition that later scribes eventually committed to manuscript, the tradition tells us that the tales of Oisín and the Fianna were kept alive through this crucial moment of transition. This was a remarkable act in the context of his mission, for he was preserving the stories of the pagan world even as he worked to convert Ireland to Christianity. It suggests that Patrick understood something profound, that these stories possessed value not necessarily because they were true in the sense of historical factuality, but because they contained truths about human nature and human experience that would be lost if they were allowed to pass away with Oisín's death. And so the legend of Oisín and Niamh and Tír na nÓg was preserved, not through the devotion of pagan warriors as it might have been in ages past, but through the effort of a Christian missionary who recognized that the old ways and the new faith could perhaps coexist in the realm of story and memory, if not in the realm of actual practice and belief. After Oisín's death, the stories were continued and elaborated upon by others. They were told and retold, recited by bards and poets who understood that they had been entrusted with something precious and significant. The tales became part of the Fianna cycle, one of the great bodies of Irish mythology and literature, and they were preserved in medieval manuscripts by monks who, though they had been trained in the Christian faith, understood the value of the cultural heritage that they had inherited. The legend of Oisín became embedded in Irish consciousness in such a way that the very phrase Oisín behind the Fianna became a common expression used to describe someone who found themselves lagging behind in a rapidly changing world, separated from those they loved by the relentless passage of time. The expression preserved not only the story itself but also the emotional truth that lay at its heart, the recognition that some people find themselves separated from the world they knew by forces beyond their control, left behind by time and circumstance and change. The character of Oisín, as preserved in the legends, became a symbol of the tragic beauty of the human condition itself. He represented the faithful soldier who could never quite leave behind his loyalty to those he had loved and to the world he had known. He represented the artist whose love of beauty was so profound that even paradise could not entirely satisfy his longing for home. He represented the man caught between worlds, unable to fully belong to either the world of his birth or the world he had found with Niamh. The legend has endured for over 1,000 years, inspiring poets and storytellers across the Celtic lands and beyond. William Butler Yeats, one of Ireland's greatest poets, drew inspiration from the story of Oisín when he composed his epic poem, The Wanderings of Oisín, creating a new artistic elaboration of the ancient legend that brought it into dialogue with the concerns and sensibilities of his own era. The story has been retold and reimagined countless times, each retelling adding new dimensions to the tale while preserving the essential emotional and spiritual truth that lies at its heart. The legend speaks to something eternally human in its audience. It speaks to the longing for beauty and for a world in which suffering has no place, yet it also acknowledges that such paradises, even if they could be reached, cannot ultimately satisfy the human soul's need for connection to one's own people, to one's own history and culture. It speaks to the tragedy of time itself, to the awareness that all things pass and that those we love will eventually age and die, and to the particular sorrow that comes when one is separated from one's loved ones by time itself, by forces that render normal reunion impossible. It is a story that speaks to the deep Irish sense of loss and longing, to the awareness of ages and empires that have passed away, to the melancholy knowledge that beauty is always tinged with the awareness that it will fade. And yet it is also a story of love and loyalty, of the refusal to forget and the determination to hold on to memory even when all else has been lost. A closing word. So here we have come to the end of the story of Oisín and his gentle memories of Tír na nÓg. We have travelled with him from the halls of the Fianna into the realm of eternal youth, and we have returned with him to a homeland transformed by the passage of centuries. We have witnessed the birth of love and the tragic beauty of separation, and we have heard how the old world gave way to the new, yet not before its stories were preserved and honoured. I hope that this tale has brought you a kind of peace as we have journeyed through it together, that you have found in the story of Oisín something that speaks to your own heart, something that reflects truths about time and love and memory that we all must contemplate. The story of Oisín reminds us that the people and the places we love remain within us, carried in our hearts and in our memories, even when we are separated from them. It reminds us that loyalty and love are among the highest values a human being can embody, and that the willingness to sacrifice one's own happiness for those we love is a kind of courage that is perhaps more profound than any courage displayed in battle. If you have enjoyed our time together in this gentle exploration of Irish legend, I invite you to join me again soon. There are so many more stories from the rich heritage of Celtic mythology and Irish folklore waiting to be explored, so many tales of beauty and wonder and sorrow and triumph. But for now, I hope you will rest easy, carrying with you the memory of Oisín and Niamh, and perhaps finding in their story a reminder of the eternal nature of love and the importance of cherishing the people and the places that matter most to us. Thank you, dear listeners, for allowing me to guide you through this tale. May your own memories be as gentle as Oisín's, and may you always find in beauty and in story a refuge from the world's harshness. Sleep well, and dream of green hills and golden-haired maidens and magical realms where love never fades and beauty never truly dies. For in some sense, those realms exist eternally within all of us, carried in the timeless realm of story and memory.